Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Miller. Thank you for joining our live stream today. I'm Mike with Appalachian Technologies, and I am really excited today to bring on a few of our own here from our organization and talk about PCI, talk about security and things that you have to do in your organization to protect today, specifically credit cards, your card data environment. So stay tuned. I'm going to bring these guys up on stage. We have Ashley, Jimmy, and Yoel. Awesome. How are you guys doing?
Doing well.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. How are you guys? So what I thought we would do, if you guys are okay, let's just go around and Ashley, maybe we'll just start with you. We'll just do intros around the room, and then we'll just get started. I'm really excited.
Yeah. Hey, I'm Ashley Loudon. I've been with Appalachian Technologies for about 5.5 years. I work in sales and marketing. And while I myself am not the technical one here, I'm lucky to say that I work regularly with the likes of Jimmy and Yoel and Mike, who are the guys who know the things, and I make the things look nice.
You definitely do a good job at that for sure. And we thank you for all of your help. Jimmy, how about yourself?
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Jimmy Armour. I've been with Appalachian now for 3 years. Yeah, 3 years. I'm the practice lead of NIST, SOC 2, and CIS GRC services here.
That's awesome. And Jimmy does a fantastic job as well. He puts me to shame all the time with his depth of knowledge. So thank you, Jimmy, for being here, man. We really appreciate it today. And then we have fabulous Yoel. Go ahead, buddy.
Hi, my name is Joel Alvarez. Afternoon, everyone. I've been with Appalachia. It's going to be 3 years this summer. And I get to use my expertise by helping clients mature their cybersecurity practice in general. So I'm always thrilled to talk shop and join this amazing team and just providing awareness in general. So thank you, Mike, for the space.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all, for being here today. So, while we were just talking here, backstage, and, you just said 5 minutes ago how passionate you were about this particular framework, right? Because it's so large, it's so detailed, it's so granular, and you can really build, no matter what you're doing, you can really build a strong security posture just using the PCI framework. But let's talk about the PCI framework for a second. What, Yoel, makes it so unique than the NIST framework or any other type of framework?
Yeah, I think that we need to account first for how PCI came to be and some of the understanding of the complexities of the framework itself or the standard. The council itself that put together the group of standards came to fit a specific need to protect credit card data or payment card information in general. The push to get a standard out came due to the rise in fraudulent transactions and a way to enforce how those managing that information had to have a security standard to implement it. So it applied to a large set of providers. If you are collecting, processing, storing, doing any type of, I want to say, business-related actions that regard to credit card or debit card information in general, I think that knowing that you now have a standard that applies to you specifically brought a lot of light into how you approached that security. But at the same time, it brought a lot of requirements. That's what I think it makes it unique. Because when I go back and I compare the standard itself to something like a NIST, and you do a one-on-one comparison, you see a lot of similarities. But when you get to understand the business behind it, the depth of the compliance, the levels that they have separated or issued for the merchants, how they have a specific set of standards if you are collecting or processing credit card, and somewhat a different one if you're developing applications to process that credit card. So you have to be on both sides to really understand how it works. And then it's when you come to implement it that really have to see how complex it is. And then, of course, if you're passionate about cybersecurity in general, like I am, you see that level of complexity and it helps you be involved at multiple levels beyond IT specifically, especially on the business side. And I think that's what makes it the most intriguing if you, again, are passionate about it. But then you go into, depending on the level of effort that was put into that compliance effort, because a brand new organization, or if it's somewhat of a mature, large retail company as well, you see the fluctuations of how understanding PCI is. dealing with legacy devices, dealing with volume, dealing with a breach. So yeah, that's what I think makes the PCI standard itself unique in terms of how mature you have to be as you grow along with it.
I love I love how granular it is. And one thing that I picked up on that you said is, the business side of it, right? I think there's no better way to get to learn the entire organization by, than using the PCI framework, because it's not just about alerts and it's not just about antivirus and firewalls. It's about policies. It's about procedures. It's about how the company does things, right? So it's a really good way to not only work with the technical team, right? But it's also a really good way to get to know the stakeholders, the board, But then, we have to also make sure that, as a consultant, we have to be able to speak at that business level. You know what I mean?
And I
So,
think
yeah, go
that's
ahead.
usually a case that is missed early on your first steps when you're dabbling with PCI in general. Most people kind of face it for the first time thinking it's a standard that you have to follow on an implementation for a compliance check that you have to do. And I think as you learn and you go through the process of getting more familiar with it is when you understand, wow, yeah, I need to take this a step above because this is not going to cut it just checking the box. So I agree with you. It's the business side that has the biggest impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned about a standard that you have to follow. So I'm gonna use that line that you mentioned there just to kind of transition a little bit. So, and I've had people ask me this, right? So are the PCI standards, is it a law? Who is it that's going to make me enforce, or who is it that's going to enforce that I'm PCI compliant, right? So can you talk about that a little bit too, as far as where does that enforcement come from?
Yeah, I think that it comes in different shapes and forms. One is if you are starting the business now and you're going to be dealing with credit card information in general or debit, usually you are aware of PCI. But what happens is with the new iterations coming out, businesses came to realize they needed to be compliant because it was their primary bank, requiring bank, knocking at their door and saying, hey, you have to be compliant with this. And we have visibility into how you process credit cards in general because we are your bank. So here we have a message from Visa, MasterCard, Amex, and the creators of this standard. And we are the ones interfacing with you. And by the way, if you're not compliant, we're going to fine you. So there's a heavy burden that comes with that knock on the door saying, hey, this is the item that you have to comply with. We have enough information to determine what level of compliance you have to be at. And at the same time, we are demanding that you have to follow this set of rules for when you need to submit the information, what type of depth that level of information has to be, the level of evidence that you have to submit along with it. So I think that's what you face the most when you're going into the standard and understanding it. But the banks are the ones that carry the most weight in enforcing it in this case. And if you compare it to another, a GDPR privacy, for instance, from the European Union, or some of the NIST ones that we have here, Siemens even, you have a government component helping enforcing that. What makes PCI again unique is the banks and Amex and the big card processors pulling all the weight and giving the standard teeth, which is what I think most people struggle with in the beginning, especially if you're facing the threat of a fine or even closing businesses in that case.
Yeah. And, so just so everybody heard it, and you mentioned a couple of times, it's not the government, it's not the state, it's not your local municipality, it's the bank, right? And think about this. Someone runs a transaction at your organization. It's kind of like magic, right? 3 days later, that money ends up in your account. Well, it goes through that acquirer, it goes through the bank, and your bank is the deciding factor of what you have to do for, what level of compliance you have to be at, and so which we'll talk about here in a minute. But it's like you said as well, they're going to, if you don't abide by them, they're going to slap you with fines. And I can tell you, I've worked with organizations that have said, you know what, Mike, it's cheaper for us to pay the fines than it is to get compliant. That might work for a very short time, right? So, but let's talk about a large organization. Let's say we have a chain of stores that's 1,000 stores across the world, and they have 15 checkout aisles within the stores. Well, first thing they're going to do is slap you with fines, right? But so, large companies are like, oh, you know what, we'll just pay that. Well, then what they're going to do is they're going to come back and say, well, you know what, for a card in hand transaction, we're going to charge you maybe 1.9% or 1.5%. Maybe that's what you've been charged all these times. So figure that 1.5% times all of your transactions over even a short time period. But now they come back and say, well, you know what? Since you're high risk, since you're not compliant, we're now going to charge you 3%. So let's think about that for a second. It's your money on the line as well. And I've also had organizations say, well, you know what? This happened a few years ago. We're just not going to take credit cards anymore. Well, let's think about that. I'm the guy who swipes his local sheets, which is just a chain, right? I'm the guy who walks in and buys a 99-cent chocolate milk with my card, right? I drive them crazy. But think about what that would do if you had the card networks taken away from you, that you can't take those. So people don't realize just how much we rely on those card swipes, or how much businesses rely on those card swipes. So Jimmy, Yoel, anyone, feel free to kind of chime in there, give your thoughts.
You made a comment that I think is relevant when you mentioned, for instance, a supply chain or a large retailer across the world. And world is that came to mind right away. And I think that in terms of applicability for a standard or a framework, often when you find international presence, you think ISO or ISO 27001. You don't see an CSF, or you don't see something like CMMC across the globe. Yet PCI has that reach, right? Because it's multi industries, is across multiple dependencies, but usually the bank is a common denominator across the board. And Visa, MasterCard, Amex, and similar are definitely a global presence. So that compliance can extend beyond your boundaries on the physical term, right? And I think the other item that you mentioned is significant is what's at stake if I decide to ignore, right, the compliance requirements. And one of them is the actual fine. And I think that to better explain it, we can get into the technical terms a little bit using something like a merchant ID. So when you do business and you get that deposit for the card transaction that you mentioned, usually Visa, MasterCard, Amex, and similar, they give you a unique ID that when that card is swiped, if that terminal is linked to your account, that's when you get the deposit. Fees are taken out, the technicalities of it and the security is something we can discuss further down the line. But I think that unique merchant ID is what the bank uses to say, well, I see this ID processing up to 20,000 transactions per year. That mandates that you're going to be now a PCI merchant level 4, right? And I think that to dabble into that and use that T, there are 4 levels of merchant. We can use that as soon as I finish my thought here. But is that level of visibility that they get in the transactions. That's why they get to decide what level of security or level of compliance you have to be with or following, because again, that visibility gives them that power. And in rare cases, if we talk about levels, they have the ability to say, although you only process up to 20,000 transactions, you're such a high risk because you ignore compliance. We have fined you. We have increased the percentages. We are now treating you as if you are a merchant level 1 instead of just a level 4 where you get to submit your own questionnaires and you get to do it. They can actually bring it up just out of judgment and say, you are such a high risk that the next item for me, if you don't comply with a merchant level 1, is going to be shut your line of money down completely. You will not be able to use the services from Visa, MasterCards, or similar through this bank anymore. So what do? You go and find another bank. Well, your merchant ID remains the same. And the banks do talk to each other. So you carry that risk along with you. That's why we needed to be more of I think, understanding of that business side and the actual implications of ignoring the compliance level. And I think that, after we finish our thoughts here, we can talk a little bit more about the levels and the implications from that. But I just wanted to bring awareness into that.
It's funny you said that about going to another acquirer, because when you're a business, and I've dealt with this in the past, when you open for business, you have so many businesses coming at you wanting your card business, right? Because they want that 1 or 2% off of every transaction. So I've worked with organizations as well that said, you know what, we're just going to change and go to, but just like you said, that merchant ID stays the same. So it's going to be the same across the board. So it doesn't really work like that, and another misconception, I think this can kind of take us into that transition to the merchant levels as well, is that, and I hear this a lot too, hey, Mike, we're just a small mom and pop shop. We might be lucky to take 300 credit cards a year. Do we really have to worry about this PCI stuff? And my response to them is, even if you're selling goods at a local craft show, but you're sitting there at your table taking these credit cards, right? You're still held to the same terms or the same compliance terms as someone who's taking 6 million cards, right? Some of those compliance measures are still the same. They don't necessarily change. However, the method of auditing and checking on those is much different. So, but before I move on, Jimmy, do you have anything that you want to kind of add to that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you all covered a lot, right? I think PCI is such a unique framework. It's an amazing framework. And in reality, it's probably one of the first frameworks that really came out that's not, when I hear PCI, right, I really hear like third-party vendor risk management, right? I mean, it's the banks essentially policing their own environment, right? Essentially saying, if you want to be able to provide services, have payment card information, you need to play ball. Here are the requirements. And to UL's point, they have teeth, right? There are specifically 4 levels. They're defined. The requirements, all 260 of them, if I remember off the top of my head correctly, very clearly outlined of, what you need to do, right? And to be able to go through and map, because, being in the GRC space, right? All GRC frameworks are kind of like sisters of each other in a way, right? But they're kind of different GRC frameworks that are out there. They're a kind of pass fail, like the CMMC, the PCI, right? Like, this is what you need to do. If you don't do this, you fail. And then you have kind of like the maturity models, right? The NIST CSFs, you the ISO 27K1, the CIS, V8, that type of stuff, right? I really think PCI is really good. And even if you didn't necessarily want to handle PCI, but you want to do intellectual property and cover your company information, you could probably even use it for that too. I mean, it is a very detailed standard that you could use it for. And it's very unique because it's so pointed. And it's very difficult to not do well as long as you're following it, right? But yeah, it's an amazing standard.
Yeah, and something you said as far as being able to use a PCI framework for something else, besides protecting card data. So PCI is built around, PCI stands for payment card industry, right? So it's talking about your payment cards. But as we were talking about yesterday too, just prepping for this, it could be intellectual property that we want to protect, right? But we could still use the PCI framework in order to do that. Because at the end of the day, technology is technology. And you're going to see across the board, whether it's CMMC, whether it's the NIST CSF or PCI, you're going to see a lot of the same things, a lot of the same type of requirements, right? But the PCI standard really works very well for protecting client data, intellectual property, anything that you want to protect, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's very much, like I said before, the third party, vendor risk management. It's unique in the way that it's not really government driven. It's, its own entity. The banks are really enforcing this. And we see it now with CMMC, with the government saying, if you want to play ball, you got to get audited. Here's the framework, all that type of stuff. But PCI really kind of was the beginning of that. And from a third-party vendor risk management perspective, it's done very, very well. And I think if you wanted to protect, even if you don't want to do payment card information, right, and you have other intellectual property and you're worried about securing that, you could really implement PCI standards around that as well, if you wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to start talking about the levels a little bit. And Yoel, I know you're an expert on this. Break it down for me. We hear there's 4 levels. We hear level 1, we hear level 4, but I'm an organization trying to figure out where I should be. Talk to me about that.
That's another aspect that makes it unique, because the standard, although it remains the same, and it applies to the person processing one transaction, to the person or the business that processes 6 million plus on a level 1, the standard remains the same. They break it down and they help you at least itemize it in a way to simplify compliance to an extent. But I think that they did a brilliant job at breaking those. And the numbers, the first time you read them, they don't necessarily make a lot of sense, right? So the tier ones or level ones are the ones that process 6 million plus transactions a year. The level 2 is going to be the million to 6 million transactions. The level 3 is going to be 20,000 to a million. And that's a number that threw me off a little bit. I'm like, well, 20,000 too. And they came out with these numbers, of course, on average, because again, they do have the information to help. Okay, this is a line that separates like a small startup type of like shop that you're making to an actual established company. And that's going to be above the 20,000. But that tier 4 or level 4 is going to be the 1 to 20,000. Like I said, it applies if you just run one transaction a year. You still have to follow the rules. Because you have the same merchant ID, you have the same type of banking background and network, and they enabled you as if you were growing as an organization or a business. You now have the ability to use the same network to enable that growth, right? So as you go into the merchant levels, I think that let's go back again to the basics. The framework or the standard is the same. The controls are the same. They ask you and they demand that you comply with. It's on the business side that you have to understand the implications of that framework and the standard. It does demand that you have things like we mentioned here, the AVs of the world, a SIM to collect the information, a resemblance of how do I respond to a type of incident. So it does follow a lot of best practices, but when it comes down to, okay, can I afford to implement all of that? That's when you really see the tiers or the levels playing out a lot. Jimmy mentioned something super interesting, and it's a GRC type of environment or program. If you are able to leverage something like a GRC program to manage it, that makes a lot of sense. But again, if you process 10 transactions a year, does it really make sense to implement it? So you don't see a lot of like tier 4 or level 4 businesses leveraging GRC programs to do it. You do see somewhat when you're like between the 20,000 and the million transactions a year, a resemblance of more security tools implemented, a resemblance of more availability of resources to manage the program. So, of course, a lot of the businesses creating solutions for this cater to the small, shop up to the 20,000. And we see a lot of technologists today saying, hey, you don't have to worry about compliance. We manage everything. You give us access. We handle everything, and your scope is minimized. So you see a lot of business growth in that area. But when you go above level 3 into level 2, that's when you see a lot more enforcement. At that point, it's highly recommended that you have a GRC program in place. Because if you're managing all the way up to 6 million credit cards, the chances of you going over into tier 1 are pretty high at that point. Because then the threshold is like 1 million to 6. And you're like, well, could a business go from a tier 4 all the way up to 20,000 to tier 1 within a year? Yeah, they could. Businesses have taken up such an upscale or growth that they have surpassed 6 million transactions a year easily. But let's circle back to a comment I made earlier. If you suffer a data breach, that automatically triggers the decision making to say, oh, was that 100 transactions a year? I still have to treat you like a tier 1.
Yeah.
Because you suffered a data breach, right? And that's what makes it also unique. Is like they don't necessarily base it on an individual whose information may be actually exposed on a data breach. Well, that individual alone had 10,000 transactions. So I'm going to treat that as the volume it deserves because of how big of an impact that could be, right? How many credit cards did you use to run those transactions? So yeah, that's another aspect that makes it, I think, interesting enough. And at the same time, that shows a parallel between the maturity of your cybersecurity in general as you scale up on the levels that PCI set before us.
As you and Jimmy were talking, I'm thinking many of the, according to the United States Chamber of Commerce, 99% of the businesses in the United States are small businesses, right? So what is a small business? That's any business that's under 500 employees. And many businesses, especially the small businesses, when you're swiping your card at your local donut shop or, getting your car tires changed, your car dealer, there's a lot of the honor system being used. And we'll talk about that further here as well. But when you're at the lower levels, level 3 and 4, these organizations they're allowed to do what they call an SAQ, a self-attested questionnaire, where they're filling out they're marking, they're basically checking their own box saying, yep, we're doing this, yep, we're doing this, yep, we're doing this. And it's a lot of the honor system, right? Because how do we know that our local car dealer that we just got car parts from is protecting my card data? Because there's a really good chance they're not doing over 1 million cards a year, right? So, Yoel, do you want to talk about maybe the difference between, like, what is a ROC, right? What's an SAQ? What's a ROC? And like, what's the big difference between those two?
Well, I can tell you, we can do a whole webinar on SAQs alone.
I know. Yeah, we'll save that for another day because there's a ton of them. Yeah.
But I think that to simplify it, right, if you look at the 4 merchant levels, the tier 1 through 4, tier 1s, which is the 6 million plus transactions a year, are the ones that are mandated to have an independent third party come in and audit their PCI practice and then develop, like you're saying, a ROC, a report on compliance. And that basically determines, okay, you do follow this per practice because we have an independent third party coming in and certifying you. Now, the tier 2, 3, and 4 are the ones that are allowed because they haven't surpassed the 6 million. And I'm going to bundle them into one because it's very similar.
Absolutely.
If you have not surpassed the 6 million a year transactions, you are allowed to submit what is called a self-assessment questionnaire. So the bank usually provides you with a portal, or you can use a certified third party to submit your SAQ. And then you basically follow a questionnaire based on your maturity with the PCI standard, based on the technologies you have implemented, based on the level of security that you have and all the boxes that you were able to check along. You can submit that with what is called a scan of your environment, with what is called a pen test, and people use different terms, but it's a similar concept, like an outside party making sure that the interfaces you have against the internet are somewhat secure. So you have to submit some evidence along with this self-assessment questionnaire, and then that enables you to say, okay, I'm compliant to this extent. But again, you assess that yourself. We know the limitations of doing that solo at home. And by the way, the risk of jumping above the 6 million, I think you have to be on the lookout for, especially have visibility into that. Because the moment you cross the threshold, the bank is going to enforce it as soon as. They don't wait. So if you know your growth is going to be estimated to be to that level, you need to be prepared to do that. So the main differentiator is, like, can I submit this myself all the way up to level 2? Or am I enforced, or am I required to use a third party to come in and certify that I am PCI compliant?
Yeah, it's again, it's amazing to think that really it's much of the honor system. It's like when you have food in a refrigerator and you pull a soda out and you lay $1 there, you're hoping that most people do at the end of the day. And I tell you, there's every time, just because I'm close, I have a passion for PCI just like you do, Yoel. And every time, last night I ate out at a restaurant and I'm thinking, wonder what they're doing with my card data, doubt they have a local SOC that they're protecting this with.
That assessment leaves a lot of room for you to draw like a gray area in compliance. And it gives me the ability to necessarily play with, like, is this really, like the requirement that I want to submit as a yes or a no? Am I able to invest money in this technology that is being asked? Yeah. So you can get away with a lot. There's a lot of flexibility in those SAQs that you can submit.
Absolutely. Ashley, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah. Can I ask a question here? So I'm the non-technical person. I'm a consumer. And you had said, Mike, that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce says that 99% of businesses in the U.S. are considered small business. Yep. So where does a 501c3 fall into it? Because, for example, like I go to the snack bar at my kid's baseball game and they're using Square Pay to swipe my card. Does a 501c3 still fall under PCI responsibilities, or we as consumers look at business versus nonprofit and the way that we spend our money and the way that we give our money differently?
That's a good question. I don't think that that nonprofits are going to be treated any different, because you're still, and there's many very large nonprofits out there too that are handling millions of cards, right? So they are still held to the same standard because they have a ton of customer data that's their card data that's coming through the network. So I've never seen anything that they've been held any differently. They're either a level 1 or level 1 through 4. But Jimmy, Yoel, feel free to kind of chime in on that as well.
And Ash, you mentioned there Apple and Google Pay. behind the scenes, they're still Visa, MasterCard, and the others. By the way, it's a monopoly. Like I said, they have their hands worldwide, and you can provide a new service. You can disguise it as whatever you want. It's going to be a Visa, MasterCard, or similar behind the scenes, regardless. So yes, you still have to follow, even if you use those services.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Great question. Go ahead, Jimmy.
And to your point, Ash, about 501c3 and people using like Squarespace or whatever it is that they connect to their phone to swipe the credit card transactions, right? A lot of that is outsourcing a lot of that PCI compliance, right? They don't necessarily see the credit cards, right? They're working with a vendor that'll process the credit card transactions, and then they'll work with that vendor to get the money and all that type of stuff. And they take a certain percentage and all that fun stuff, right? I had long conversations with my mom when she's now, retired and does her own like seashell work and artwork, and she goes to craft fairs and she has the same thing in her phone. And I'm sitting there like, oh man, PCI, right? Like you're having people swipe the credit card on your phone. Yeah. But yeah, a lot of it is just outsourcing and working with those, those different vendors, right? And they're not treated really any differently. They still are ranked based off of the amount of credit card transactions that they have.
Jimmy, I love that you jumped in, because if anybody knows Jimmy is very concerned about that third party aspect whenever we're talking about compliance and like how that can be a huge area of risk. So I love that was your quick reaction of, hey, it's outsourced. There's a third party involved there. So yeah, true to form. Good job, Jimmy.
Yeah, I mean, the third-party vendors management has been massive, right? I mean, even just going back to the biggest data breach that we can all think of, at least in the last, decade plus, right, is the Target data breach, right, of 2013, if I have the year correct, coming in through the HVAC vendor, right? I mean, that's third-party vendors management. Do they have access into your environment? What access do they have? Is it monitored? Could you see anything if it's malicious? So yeah, third-party vendors management is something I'm very passionate about.
Yeah, and that's something you have to be concerned about, because even if your organization goes and receives a report on compliance or fills out your SAQs, just like you said, those third parties that have access to your network, what's their security posture look like? And that's why managing those third parties is extremely important. And when we're talking about big third party vendors, you can ask for their ROC. Let's see your ROC. Let's look at their report and see how they're protecting their controls as well.
Yeah, compliance is not really secure. Sorry, go ahead, you.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, let's stay off of that comment on Target, because I think that is a good discussion topic, and I see a comment also popping up. They had just submitted their PCI compliance status right prior to that breach, right? So I think that if we talk retail at that level, that size, we know it's a merchant level 1 regardless because of the size, right? How do you really get PCI to cover that, HVAC system, that integrated level of detail and security? And let's circle back to a comment you made, and maybe if we combine it with other frameworks, if we go back and then give this a little bit more teeth, because let's face it, at a level, since you make a standard that is supposed to cover one transaction to 6 million plus, you allow for some flexibility in between, the use of what they call compensating controls, for the sake of allowing you to submit that compliance, right? So let's basically bump it up a little bit in the level of complexity and technicality and say, well, how do I then give my already good standard more ability to detect what else, especially if I'm a retailer at that level? We can use, like I said, a good GRC program to see that, and then being able to map the PCI specific control or objective to a similar one that has a little bit more depth, like an SCSF. And then if you have an international presence, going back to my comment about a world retailer, well, you have to have ISO and you have to have other standards that really take that to the next level. But a very common one that we see often is a combination of PCI and SOC 2. And you still have to submit them. But if you're publicly traded, this is my own experience, you also have to use SOCs. So if anyone has ever dealt at that level, which I know Target probably did too, when you combine those frameworks and you are in charge of overseeing compliance at a whole level and security, hopefully in your organization, how do I shuffle multiple standards, multiple frameworks while maintaining compliance, while continuing the effort to implement? And you have to rely, like you said, on those GRC programs and tools to really map that automatically and develop a more in-depth program down the line.
Yeah, I think there's no real silver bullet, right? I mean, I think like it's it's a problem that everybody deals with. There's tons of different compliance that people have to follow. You named it Sarbanes-Oxley if you're publicly traded. You have SOC 2 if you want to be going for a SOC 2 attestation. You have PCI, PCI concerns. You have a ton of different GRC or GRC frameworks or different compliances that you have to follow, right? The biggest thing with all of them is knowing where you need to be compliant and what you need to be compliant with, right? And we talked even about this yesterday in prep for this call, right? Knowing your PCI environment, knowing where your payment card information is, being able to scope that, and then, specifically when looking at PCI, looking at that particular environment and holding that to PCI. Now, when I noted before, compliance doesn't equal secure, right? Because we've talked to a lot of clients about looking to kind of scope their PCI environment, looking to scope different environments for different other compliance, frameworks that they need to deal with standards, right? If they're going to scope down their compliance framework to be 20% of their environment, well, what are you then doing for the other 80% of your environment, right? You can't have and just be like completely secure in this 20% and then not secure in the other 80%. You need to be pulling in other frameworks, crosswalking, right? That's a big term in the GRC space, is crosswalking the different frameworks between each other and utilizing. I prefer to use a maturity model framework if you're going to crosswalk, like a NIST CSF, like an ISO 27001, right? Have that maturity model to then do the cost benefit analysis, right? Determine what secure means for your organization, because saying that you're compliant is great. Compliant kind of checks the box. You want to make sure that you have that security, and security is how secure do we want to be? You need to be able to make a risk-based decision. It needs to be a cost-benefit analysis, right? You need to look at it and make the determination. But yeah, I think the biggest thing with PCI is just knowing what your environment is and then scoping that environment.
The Discover, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and I think it was Diners Club came together way back in the day to form the PCI Council. And they didn't form these PCI compliance. They didn't form this framework for organizations to become compliant. That's not why they did it. They formed these requirements so that we can protect data, right? So just to what you were saying, Jimmy, sure, we can narrow the scope down as much as we can and use a PCI framework where we need to use it. But at the end of the day, like you said, how are you protecting those other things? We don't just leave the back door open because we don't have to be compliant there. Our goal is to protect our customer data. And this isn't just about, it's about the reputation of the organization as well, right? So we want to treat our customers well by protecting their data. When someone sits down at a restaurant and they hand you a card to go swipe, I want to believe that they are doing their best job to protect my data, not just because they want to check a box and fill out an SAQ,
I want to tee off of something that Jimmy said, and I think that for the technical audience that we have, it makes sense, right? So say you're like starting from scratch and you're now being handed this PCI hot potato that you need to comply with. The first question I would like to know or ask is, how many transactions a year are we doing? Kind of oftentimes when we see someone from IT being handed this responsibility, or someone just on the audit or compliance team, they might not necessarily have visibility into that side of the business. We know, like, in terms of volumes, and we know like budgets and then, goals and deadlines that we have, but how many transactions is a very technical number to know, right? And that is the first step to help you build the scope. And then you can ask, well, how many individuals from within the organization are involved in the critical processing side of things? Well, you get more visibility. And then, well, what technology do we have in place to really manage this, volume of transactions? And at that moment, you're like, well, it so happens that every single device in the organization is exposed because it's part of the scope. Yep. And then you have to follow the best practices that, again, go across multiple frameworks of segmentation, limiting your scope, reducing your visibility in terms of, okay, whom else is involved and how do we minimize that? What third parties can we leverage to reduce the risk? That's when you see it being more mature and growing. But I think that in terms of visibility, if you're starting, you need to be aware, again, of the number of transactions first and go from there.
And you'd be surprised how many organizations don't know that.
That's exactly what I mentioned.
When I was auditing, and I would say, what's your approximate card number count? And everyone looks at each other like, I don't know. And many times it would take weeks before I could actually get that information.
Yeah.
Typically this is with the smaller, level, level 2, 3, 4. They just have no clue, So yeah, that I was always shocked by just organizations not knowing that, or like you said, it's another part of the business that they might not communicate to as well.
I had to reverse engineer that question oftentimes, because depending on the type of SAQ that was demanded by the bank, I was able to say, well, based on the questions they're asking you, that translates usually they should be roughly around like this tier. But even then, it wasn't even an accurate number, because it's like, this is just giving me like, you are between 20,000 and a million. So we don't know the full depth of those transactions. We can go on the average, but we need to know the actual number. And goes back to my original topic, because what if you're close to the million? It means that you're going to jump a tier before you know it. It means that your business needs to account for that level of visibility if you go through a data breach. Because let's face it, you talk reputation, and I often see PCI mixed with something like GDPR or CCPA from California. And it's like, well, what happens do we even have a public relationship, program in place to react to a data breach? Depending on the state we're doing business on, do we have like laws that we need to follow, that we need to notify in case of a breach? Then at the same time, what happens to the organization if we suffer a breach at that level and they take all the information? Can we allow for a downtime that then we have to go back and react? And Jimmy, to your point, even if you use a secure third party to process it, if that third party suffers a breach and you have quite a large amount of customers, even though you were secure, the customer's information is exposed. And then you have to go through that third party to communicate to all the clients and to make sure that they are aware that their information was exposed. So you're still responsible for a lot of it. That's why, and I often get this question too, is like, can my HAQ be 0 questions? No, it will never be. Because regardless of how much of that responsibility, and we're using that word loosely here, I'm going to call it liability, but responsibility, regardless of how much of that responsibility of protecting the data you transfer away, reducing your scope, sending that to a third party, there's a component of you as a business that you have to comply with. So that's when you say, well, do I use PCI? Can I add another standard? How do I make this standard across the board, if you would, for the lack of better words? You still carry a level of responsibility that you have to commit to your clients at that point. So, of course, that goes up depending on the size and the version level, to reference that original topic, but it will never be 0. You always carry that weight on your shoulders if you're doing business.
Anybody watching this, anyone in this room can be an ambassador for, you don't have to be a QSA, you don't have to be working with the PCI Council, you don't have to be in charge of your GRC program. But what you can do as someone who works for an organization that takes credit cards is be an ambassador. Start asking some of these questions. How many cards do you think we take a year? What level merchant are we? Hey, I've been reading this 300-page document on PCI. Are we doing a lot of these things? You start asking questions, then that might raise some good conversations. And of course, here's my shameless plug. Then, of course, you can have them reach out to us here at Appalachia. So we can certainly help you with those things. I'm going to open this up for, we'll just take a second here, open it up for questions. If anyone has any particular questions, whether they're, technical, detailed, or high level, now's your time. We're definitely rolling up on the time. But yes, as the banner says, just throw your questions into the comment there. Ashley, I know that we have a handout, right? Do you want to just talk about that for a second, and how, we have some really good information and some blog articles I'm going to talk about here in a minute, but do you want to talk about the handout?
Absolutely. So I'm going to show up here on the bottom. We have a handout that goes along with this. UL took some time to go through what those 4 levels are and some of those things that indicate how you know what level you're in. So we have a handout that's available. If you're interested, send an email to info@appalachiatech.com. In the subject line, just put in PCI webinar handout, and we'll make sure to get that sent over to you.
Yeah, we have some really good information there. And, again, you could take that information back and just show it to, a stakeholder or someone that is maybe responsible for some of these things. And it's never bad to ask some of those questions as well. They might not like you asking, but the reason you're asking is because you're concerned about that client data, right?
Like you do such a good job at spreading awareness across the board, but primarily on LinkedIn and the social media is dedicated to professional growth in general and awareness. But I think that we have to account for that one. If you are someone that is now interested in growing your career in cybersecurity or similar, right? And you get to ask those questions, come in a little bit prepared, know a little bit more about the standard, know the business, the size. Usually that's information that is available across multiple platforms. But if you want to get, inserted into that side of your career path, it is definitely an avenue that you can take. Not only asking, but like I said, coming in prepared in terms of, hey, we know we process credit cards. We know we do this extend. I want to learn more about your PCI program. And if there's an opening, I'd love to take part on. And let me tell you, someone on the technical background, as I am, I always welcome those requests. Anyone that wants to know about technology in general, just being aware, compliance, just increase your growth in terms of career path, those are always welcome. So if PCI is your avenue to go in, by all means, go ahead and take it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Bearded IT Dad just asked as well, and welcome, buddy. I haven't seen you in a long time. Happy to see you here. He asked if we have any training resources. So we have, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. We have a lot of blog articles that Jimmy, Yoel, and myself have really put together over the past few months / years. And we're going to be creating a lot more over this next, the rest of 2025. So check out our website, AppalachiaTech.com. And I believe Ashley's going to throw some links in here as well to the blog. But one I want to talk about in particularly, because let's face it, budget is always a thing. Budget's a huge factor, right? And when we start talking about protecting credit cards and meeting requirements, the biggest thing that comes up from the stakeholders is what is it going to cost us? So we put together a really nice article. The title of it's PCI DSS Compliance Without Crushing Your Budget. I would recommend reading that. I think Ashley might, we'll see how in sync she is with me right now. She's probably going to post that link here in a second. But take a look at that. And there's a lot of tips in there for meeting compliance and protecting your card data without just killing your budget. Because let's face it, like I said, that's something that you're definitely going to be to hit with. Another one that we have, 5 steps to build a PCI program that makes managing compliance easy. It's another blog article that was put together, and we have a few more as well that she's going to put the links there for. But AppalachiaTech.com, if you miss any of these links, check that out. We have a resources page. We have a lot of information regarding PCI because it is something we are passionate about, that we work with a lot, and we're just always happy to talk about those things as well. So,
Mike, I do see comments popping up in terms of training and information available to understand PCI in general. I think that being so unique and depending on the type of organization making the request, we can definitely engage with, directly with you and have like a brief call if we need to go back and have
absolutely
like a better understanding. This is not an assessment. This is not a commitment for business. It's just bringing awareness into PCI in general. But I can tell you from experience that most training programs across the board, and this is, despite the size of the organization, they are lacking training specifically related to PCI. Sometimes you see training related to privacy, growth, best practices, overall IT hygiene or security awareness training, but PCI specific training is hard to come by because so unique. The uniqueness of it. So at this point, the main resource that I can recommend is going to be the PCI Security Standard Council page specifically. They have a lot of resources available. And the main point that I will start with is go ahead and pick up the standard and read it. That's going to be your main platform. And then follow their lead in terms of the tiers and the level of compliance. A lot of materials on YouTube, but primarily understanding what those requirements are. And then, of course, we're always available to have a quick discussion if you just have, want to dedicate some time to ask. But primarily, if you go back and try to resource train it, remember that this is going to be unique to your organization. That's how rich it is. So we'll have to come back and then just get more details to give you better feedback on that.
Absolutely. And PCI Dad, I see some of your comments there, man. Reach out. A couple of us know you personally. We'd be more than happy to help you out. Some that we can definitely do there. Yoel, do you want to talk about what our next webinar is going to be about?
So that's talk about taking it to the next level, right? I think that we have hinted a little bit about this, and it's an overlap of PCI and HIPAA, for instance, because you go to the hospital and you often hear about HIPAA compliance, but they do swipe your card on the front desk, especially if you have a copay to hand out. So how are hospitals or those are mandated by the government also dealing with this standard that is industry specific, mandated by the banks? So I'd love to talk a little bit more about overlap, and then we can use that webinar also to see how you can take PCI to the next level and maybe show some evidence on how a GRC tool can help you really build that crosswalk that Jimmy was mentioning between multiple frameworks. And I then also have like an idea for a third one that we were kind of brainstorming is like, what happens if your organization is growing by either acquisition, merger, or just open on new offices, right? I think that there's a component that PCI mandates that the moment your scope involves that growth, you need to be able to absorb that. You need to be able to bring it into operations. So talk about being involved in the business in general using PCI as an avenue, right? So yeah, we can definitely talk about those details down the line. We'll have to come up with the schedule that works, but I think that's quite interesting to discuss.
Absolutely. And I tell you, before anybody leaves today, make sure I'm going to task everyone with a couple things, right? Make sure you take a second and follow, jump on LinkedIn platform. Most of you are already there. Check out Yoel, check out Jimmy Armour, check out Ashley. They're always putting out just good information on their profiles, and, just get to know them, right? These are, I always say, surround yourself with people you can learn from. And I tell you, you can definitely learn from some of these others, in this room. So take that opportunity. Follow the Appalachia Technologies Facebook page, Facebook page, LinkedIn page as well, which we're constantly putting stuff out there too. You can tell that these people are definitely passionate about this. I'm looking forward to your next webinar, Yoel. That'll be good. I'll be definitely learning from you on that, because I'm not near as familiar with HIPAA either. So that'll be good. That'll be good. Is there anything else, Jimmy, Yoel, Ashley, that you would like to add, to this conversation before we peace out for the day?
No, only that I wish I could heart some of the comments that were coming in. I see Nathaniel saying, PCI can literally build a fully functioning cyber program that aligns with most data security regulations.
Yes.
True. Very, very true.
I've seen it happen.
Yeah. And that's, I wish I could go through and heart some of those because there's some very knowledgeable people in the comments as well. No, thank you guys very much for your time.
Now imagine if we could do this like a radio show, that we could pick some comments and have them dial in and join the conversation.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I think it'll be awesome to have that level of interaction. I think that
I should have.
And Nathaniel's one you would want on there too.
Jimmy and I know Nathaniel pretty well, and it's funny he said about dialing in like the radio, because he actually does radio voiceovers. He's
there we go.
Very, very smart. So we should maybe bring him on for one of our next webinars. And
don't get me started with ideas. Just wait. We might be there.
I can send a link pretty quick. They can be in here in a second. So Bearded IT Data as well, Jared. It's good to have everybody here. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day, and hopefully you ate some lunch during this and had some good takeaways. So again, make sure you follow these people. Check out our website. And Ashley, do you want to pop up that email again one more time, just so if you want, we have it. We have a kind of a handout for today. Shoot that email over so we can get you that information as quick as we can, and just reach out. Right. We'd love to help you any way that we can. So with that said, Ashley, Jimmy, Yoel, thank you all three of you for your time today. This has been a blast. Actually, I've had a lot of fun here. And thank you everyone who tuned in. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the week. Thanks for taking the time. Have a fantastic day.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.